She was 20 years old when they married her off to a man 3 decades older. A man whose name made judges go silent, and police captains look the other way. On their wedding night, she stood trembling in his bedroom, waiting for what she believed was inevitable. But he didn't touch her. He handed her a robe. He told her to take the bed, and as he walked toward the door, she said 2 words that shattered something inside him. "Thank you. Thank you for not touching me." What she didn't know was that those weren't his real plans. The silence in the bedroom was the loudest sound Emmett Calloway had ever chosen not to break. He stood at the window of the master's suite, his back to the door, watching the last bruise of violet light sink below the estate walls. The room behind him was immaculate. White linen, low amber light from 2 bedside lamps, a bottle of wine, untouched, sweating gently on the bureau. Everything arranged by hands that were not his, everything prepared for a night he had agreed to but never desired. Emmett was 50 years old. Tall, broad through the shoulders, built like a man who had once done his own violence and now only had to remember it. His hair was dark, threaded with silver at the temples, and along the sides swept back in a way that made the sharpness of his jaw and the severity of his brow more pronounced. His suit was charcoal, tailored so precisely it looked like it had been sewn onto his body. He wore no tie. The top 2 buttons of his shirt were open, revealing a neck that was thick and corded, a neck that had never bent to anyone. He was feared. That was not vanity. That was arithmetic. 30 years of calculated brutality, quiet influence, and relentless discipline had built an empire that spanned the eastern seaboard. His name was spoken in low tones or not at all. Judges adjusted sentences with his interests in mind. Police captains called his people before calling their own. He did not need to raise his voice. He had not needed to in years. Behind him the door opened. The sound was so slight it could have been the house settling, but Emmett heard it the way he heard everything, precisely, completely, without turning. Footsteps, light, hesitant, the kind that stopped every few inches to reconsider whether they should continue. He turned. She stood in the doorway in a white dress that was not hers. It had been chosen for her, bought for her, fitted to her body without her opinion. The fabric was silk, floor-length, gathered at the waist, modest at the neckline. Her dark hair was down, falling past her shoulders in loose waves that she had clearly tried to tame and failed. Her hands were clasped together at her stomach, fingers laced so tight her knuckles had gone pale. Her name was Serafina Morrow. She was 20 years old, and she was his wife, not by choice, not by courtship, not by love, by arrangement, by transaction, by the quiet mathematics of families who traded daughters, the way other men traded debts. Emmett studied her the way he studied everything, without expression, without hurry. He noted the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes moved to his face and then immediately away, as if looking at him directly might provoke something. The slight tremor in her lower lip that she was fighting to control. The rigid posture of someone who had been taught that standing wrong was punishable. He had expected nerves, a young woman married to a man she did not know, a man with his reputation. Nerves were reasonable, but this was not nerves. This was something else. "Close the door," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that did not ask twice because it never needed to. There was no warmth in it. There was no cruelty either. It was simply the voice of a man who had lived long enough to strip all excess from his words. Serafina obeyed. Her hand found the door behind her and pressed it shut without turning around, as if she could not afford to take her eyes off him even for a moment. The click of the latch was small and final. She stood with her back to the door. Her chest rose and fell in careful, measured breaths, the kind of breathing that is learned, not natural. Inhale for 4, hold for 2, exhale for 4. A rhythm practiced so many times it had become reflex. The breathing of someone who had spent years teaching herself to be invisible. Emmett poured himself a glass of wine. He did not offer her one. "Come here," he said. She walked. She cut toward him. Each step was deliberate, controlled, and somehow smaller than it should have been, as though she were trying to cross the room without disturbing the air. She stopped 6 feet away from him. Too far for intimacy. Too close for escape. He noticed that. He set his wine down without drinking it. "Turn around," he said. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. A flash of something raw and immediate, gone so quickly that anyone else would have missed it entirely. But Emmett Calloway did not miss things. He had built his entire life on noticing what other men overlooked. She turned. Her back faced him. The silk of the dress caught the low light, and for a moment she looked like a painting, something fragile and still, framed in amber. Emmett reached for the zipper at the back of the dress. His fingers were steady. He had done this before, not like this, not arranged, not obligated. But he understood the mechanics of a wedding night, the expectations, the performance. He had no intention of being gentle because he felt something. He had every intention of being efficient because he felt nothing. The zipper slid down smoothly, 1 inch, 2, 3. The silk parted, and Emmett Calloway, who had seen men die, who had ordered executions with the calm precision of a man signing a receipt, who had spent 3 decades in a world where violence was vocabulary, froze. The scars began just below the nape of her neck and ran in layered, overlapping ridges down the length of her back and across both shoulders. Some were thin and pale, raised like cursive written in skin. Others were wider, darker, the kind that came from something heavier, a belt, a cord, something that left more than a line. There were marks that had healed cleanly and marks that had not, where the skin had torn and reformed in irregular patterns, textured and uneven, like the topography of a country ravaged by storms. They were not random. There was a pattern to them. Horizontal lines, evenly spaced, concentrated across the shoulder blades and the upper back, as though someone had been methodical about it, practiced, someone who had done this many times, someone who had done this over years. The room went still. Emmett did not move. His hand remained on the zipper, his fingers now motionless, suspended against the fabric, as though the signal between his brain and his body had been cut. His breath came in through his nose, slow, controlled, the way he always breathed. But something behind his ribs had shifted, something heavy, something that had no name yet. Serafina's shoulders drew inward, a small, unconscious motion, the motion of someone who had been seen before, who had been looked at in this exact position, and who expected what always came next: disgust, questions, or the particular silence that precedes being discarded. She waited. He could hear her breathing change. The careful rhythm she had maintained collapsed into something shorter, shallower, quicker. Her hands, hanging at her sides, began to tremble, not dramatically, not visibly, unless you were standing close enough to see the faint vibration in her fingertips. Emmett was standing that close. He did not speak. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. In those 15 seconds, Emmett Calloway understood something that rearranged the architecture of his assumptions. She was not afraid of him. She had never been afraid of him. The trembling, the controlled breathing, the way she had entered the room like someone approaching a minefield. All of it made sense now, and none of it had anything to do with his name, his reputation, or the empire he commanded. Onain, she was afraid of what always happened next. He was afraid of hands. He withdrew his, slowly, without touching her skin. He stepped back. 1 step. 2. He set his hands at his sides, palms open, as though he were disarming himself of a weapon she could not see. Who did this? His voice was quiet, quieter than before. Stripped of the controlled authority he normally wore like a second skin. This was something else entirely, something underneath, something that had not surfaced in decades. Serafina did not turn around. Her head lowered, her hair fell forward, covering the sides of her face. Her shoulders began to shake, and for one terrible moment, the room held nothing but the sound of a woman trying very hard not to cry and failing. "Please," she whispered, "please don't ask me that." It was the first thing she had said to him all evening. Her voice was small, fractured, built from borrowed air. It was the voice of someone who had learned that answering certain questions led to certain consequences, and who had been trained to deflect rather than reveal. Emmett looked at her shaking back, at the road map of pain carved into her skin, at the way she stood there, exposed, humiliated, braced for impact, and something inside him that had been dormant for so long, he had forgotten it existed, began to stir. Not desire, not pity. Rage. Cold, precise architectural rage. The kind that does not burn. The kind that builds. He picked up his wine glass and drained it in one long, silent pull. Then he set it down and walked to the closet. He removed a robe, his, dark gray, oversized, and crossed the room to where she stood. He did not touch her. He held the robe open behind her the way one holds an umbrella for a stranger in the rain. Offered, not imposed. "Put this on," he said. She turned her head just slightly, just enough to see the fabric in his hands. Her brow furrowed. Confusion rippled across her face. Genuine naked confusion. The kind that comes when reality contradicts every expectation a body has been conditioned to hold. She took the robe. She pulled it over her shoulders and wrapped it around herself, holding it closed at her chest with both hands, as if it were armor. "Sit down," Emmett said. He gestured toward the armchair beside the window. "Fee, you're sleeping there tonight. I'll take the chair in the study." She blinked. She started. "You're not sleeping with me tonight," he said, and the sentence carried no disappointment, no anger, no negotiation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty he used to close deals or end conversations. "You are sleeping, that's all. Take the bed." He moved toward the door. "Mr. Calloway." He stopped, turned. His face was unreadable. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair and the hard lines of his jaw, and for one moment he looked like exactly what the world said he was. Dangerous, impenetrable, carved from something colder than stone. "Thank you," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "For not—" She could not finish the sentence. He understood what she meant. "Thank you for not touching me. Thank you for not demanding what you paid for. Thank you for not adding your name to the list of men who have used my body as currency." Emmett Calloway looked at his wife of 6 hours and felt something settle in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. It sank slowly, displacing everything else, and by the time it reached the bottom, he knew, with absolute clarity, that this night had changed something fundamental. He did not know what. Not yet. "Good night," he said. He closed the door behind him. And for the first time in 30 years, Emmett Calloway stood in a hallway of his own home and did not know what to do next. In the bedroom, Serafina Morrow sat on the edge of the bed, with the robe pulled tight around her body, and stared at the closed door as though it were a riddle she had never been taught to solve. No man had ever given her a robe. No man had ever looked at her scars and stepped back instead of forward. No man had ever said good night and meant only that. She pulled her knees to her chest. She pressed her face into the soft fabric that smelled like cedar and something darker, something warm, something that belonged to a man she had been told was the most dangerous person she would ever meet. And for the first time, in as long as she could remember, Serafina did not cry herself to sleep because she was afraid. She cried because she was confused, because kindness, when it arrives in a place where only cruelty has ever lived, is the most disorienting thing in the world. 3 days passed. Emmett Calloway watched his wife the way he watched enemies, from a distance without announcing his attention, cataloging every detail. He watched her at breakfast, where she sat at the far end of the table and ate so carefully that each bite seemed calculated to produce the least possible sound. She buttered her toast in precise geometric strokes. She never poured her own coffee until he had poured his. She never sat down until he was already seated. She never started. eating until he had taken his first bite. These were not manners. These were survival instincts dressed in courtesy. He watched her in the hallways of the estate, where she moved along the walls, like water following a channel, always taking the path that put the most distance between herself and any person she encountered. When one of his men passed her, she would stop, press herself slightly to the side, lower her eyes, and wait until they had gone. She did not do this out of deference. She did it the way a small animal freezes when a shadow passes overhead. He watched her in the kitchen on the second morning, at 6 a.m., 2 hours before anyone else was awake. She was scrubbing the countertop. Not cleaning it, scrubbing it. Her hands were red. The sponge was soaked through. The counter was already spotless, but she continued, working in tight, obsessive circles, her face blank, her eyes unfocused, as though she were somewhere else entirely. As though her hands were performing a ritual her mind had long stopped questioning. He stood in the doorway for 45 seconds before she noticed him. When she did, the sponge dropped from her hand. She spun around. Her back hit the counter. Her breath stopped. "I'm sorry," she said, immediately, before he had spoken, before he had moved. The apology was automatic, fired from a reflex so deeply embedded it preceded all thought. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, I was just—" "Serafina." His voice stopped her, not because it was loud, because it was calm, because it held her name like a fact, not a threat. "You don't need to apologize for cleaning a kitchen." She stared at him. Her hands were shaking again. She pressed them behind her back, against the counter, hoping he would not see. He saw. "I just wanted to make sure everything was—" "The kitchen is cleaned every evening by staff." He paused. "You know that." She did know that. Her eyes dropped to the floor. The truth of what she had been doing, not cleaning, but coping, hung between them like something fragile and exposed. Emmett crossed to the coffee maker. He prepared 2 cups. He set one on the counter beside her, leaving enough space between his hand and hers that there was no risk of contact. Then he took his cup and sat at the kitchen island, 3 full stools away from where she stood. "Sit," he said. Then, after a pause that cost him more than he expected, "If you'd like." The addition surprised him. He did not typically qualify his statements. He did not give options. But something about the geometry of this woman, the way she occupied space as though trying to compress herself into the smallest possible shape, made his usual cadence feel wrong. Heavy, blunt. She picked up the coffee. She sat. Not beside him. 2 stools away, but she sat. They drank in silence. It was the longest Emmett had been in a room with another person without speaking, negotiating, or issuing instructions in over 20 years. And it was the first time he noticed that silence could have texture, that it could be thick with things unsaid, or thin and cautious, or, as it was in this moment, something resembling the very first thread of something that might, with extraordinary patience, become trust. On the 4th day, Emmett called Declan Holt into his study. Declan was his chief of security, 56 years old, built like a vault, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. He had been with Emmett for 22 years. He was the only man in the organization who could look Emmett in the eyes without flinching, and the only man Emmett trusted with something other than business. "I need a background file," Emmett said. He was standing at the window, hands clasped behind his back. "On the Morrow family. Complete. Every address, every hospital visit, every school record, every police report, sealed and unsealed. I want it. By tonight." Declan studied his boss for a long moment. "Your wife's family?" "Yes." "Something happen?" Emmett turned from the window. His face was composed, as it always was, but there was something in the stillness of it that Declan had only seen 3 or 4 times in 2 decades. Something compressed, something held back by discipline alone. "Just get me the file." Declan nodded. He did not ask again. The file arrived at 9 p.m. Emmett read it alone in his study, behind a locked door, with a glass of scotch he did not drink. The documents told a story that was not told in words. It was told in patterns, in gaps, in the specific language of institutional failure. Serafina Morrow had been admitted to the emergency room 7 times between the ages of 9 and 17. The first visit listed the cause as a fall from a bicycle, the second, a staircase, the third, another fall. By the 4th visit, the attending physician had noted in a margin, handwritten, small, a detail that should have saved a child and didn't, that the injuries were inconsistent with the stated cause. No investigation was opened. No follow-up was recorded. Her father, Garrison Morrow, was a mid-level operator in the supply chain, a man who moved product through rural corridors and had, for years, provided logistics to Emmett's network without distinction. A useful man. An unremarkable man. The kind of man who smiled at the right people and went home to a house where doors were locked from the inside. Her mother had died when Serafina was 4, ovarian cancer. After that, Garrison had raised his daughter alone. Raised was a generous word. The school records showed chronic absences. The medical records showed escalating injuries. The police records showed nothing because no one had ever called. Emmett closed the file. He sat in the darkness of his study and felt the rage he had carried since the wedding night solidify into something harder. Something with edges. Something that would, when the time came, cut with surgical precision. He thought about the scars on her back. He thought about the careful, practiced breathing, the flinching, the obsessive cleaning, the immediate apologies. Every behavior decoded, recontextualized, stripped of ambiguity. She had been broken systematically by someone who had been given the one authority that should never be weaponized. The authority of a father. Emmett poured his scotch down the sink. He sat in the dark for a long time, and when he finally moved, it was not with the cold efficiency of a man conducting business. It was with the slow, deliberate weight of a man who had just decided something that could not be undone. The next morning, Serafina found a small stack of books on the table beside the bed. She now slept in alone. There was no note, no explanation, just 5 books, carefully chosen, spines uncracked. 2 novels, a collection of poetry, a guide to the gardens of the Pacific Northwest, and a cookbook, not instructional, but the kind that was more memoir than recipe, the kind that told stories through food. She touched their spines. She did not pick them up. She did not know what they meant. She did not know if they were a gift or a test. In her experience, things given freely were debts in disguise. But she looked at them for a long time, and later that afternoon, when the house was quiet, she took the cookbook to the garden bench and opened it in the sun, and for 20 minutes she read about a woman in Tuscany who made pasta by hand while mourning her husband, and Serafina did not realize she was smiling until the wind moved her hair across her face and broke the spell. She closed the book quickly. She looked around as though someone might have seen. No one had, except Emmett, who was watching from the window of his study, his face expressionless, his chest tight with something he did not yet have the vocabulary to name. 2 weeks into the marriage, Garrison Morrow called. Emmett took the call in his study. He listened for 3 minutes. His face did not change. When the call ended, he set the phone down and remained still for a long time. Garrison wanted to visit. He wanted to see his daughter. He framed it as paternal concern. He used phrases like making sure she's settled and just a father checking in. His voice was warm, reasonable, practiced, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime constructing a version of himself that other people found acceptable. Emmett agreed to the visit, not because he wanted to, because he needed to see it. He needed to see what Garrison Morrow looked like standing in the same room as the woman whose back he had turned into a canvas of suffering. He needed to watch, he needed to measure, and then he needed to decide. Garrison Morrow arrived on a Saturday afternoon in a gray suit that was slightly too large, and shoes that were slightly too polished. He was a compact man, 5'9", with thinning hair combed carefully across his scalp, and a smile that appeared on command, wide and empty, the kind of smile that existed to fill silence. Emmett met him in the foyer. They shook hands. Garrison's grip was firm and eager, the grip of a man who wanted to be perceived as substantial. Emmett, Garrison said, and the use of the first name was deliberate, an attempt to establish familiarity where none existed. Beautiful home, truly. I can see why you... She's in the garden, Emmett said. The smile flickered, adjusted, held. Wonderful. She always did love being outside. Even as a little girl couldn't keep her indoors. He laughed. The sound was hollow. Emmett said nothing. He led Garrison through the house. They found Serafina on the garden bench. She was reading the cookbook. She had been reading it every afternoon for 3 days, sitting in the same spot, in the same position, and Emmett had noticed that each day she sat a little more comfortably, a little less like someone waiting to be interrupted. She heard their footsteps on the stone path and looked up. The book fell from her hands. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not a choice. The book simply left her fingers because every muscle in her body had locked simultaneously. Her face, which had been soft and open in the afternoon light, collapsed into something flat and rigid. Her eyes went wide, then narrow, then somewhere far away. Her shoulders drew up toward her ears. Her hands pressed flat against her thighs. She stood. "Dad," she said. One word. One syllable. And in that syllable, Emmett heard everything the file had told him, and everything it had left out. He heard the particular pitch of a voice calibrated to avoid provocation. He heard submission, layered over terror, layered over something older and deeper. The exhaustion of a person who has been afraid for so long that fear has become indistinguishable from identity. "There she is," Garrison said, and he moved toward her with his arms open. Serafina did not step back. She did not flinch. She stood perfectly still and allowed her father to embrace her, and the embrace looked normal, warm, even, except that her arms did not rise. They stayed at her sides. Her hands remained flat against her legs. Her body was rigid inside the circle of his arms, like a mannequin being held by a living man. Emmett watched. He watched the way Garrison's hand rested on the back of her neck. Casually, proprietarily, the way one holds a dog's collar. He watched the way Serafina's breathing went shallow and rapid the moment that hand made contact. He watched the way her eyes over her father's shoulder found Emmett's face and held it, not with a request, not with a plea, but with the blank, dissociated stare of someone who had gone somewhere else inside herself. Garrison released her. He held her at arm's length, hands on her shoulders, and looked at her with an expression that mimicked tenderness so precisely that anyone watching would have believed it. "You look well," he said. "Healthy. Are you eating? You look like you've put on weight." The comment landed like a blade between ribs, subtle, precise, wrapped in concern. Serafina's chin dropped 1/2 inch. Her posture, already rigid, became smaller. "I'm eating fine," she said. "Good. Good." Garrison turned to Emmett with the smile again. She was always a picky eater. "Drove me crazy. You know how girls are." Emmett looked at Garrison Morrow. He did not smile. He did not nod. He looked at him the way he looked at men who were about to discover the precise cost of underestimating him, with the absolute stillness of a predator who has already decided and is simply choosing the moment. "Let's go inside," Emmett said. "We'll have lunch." Lunch was served in the dining room. Garrison sat at one end, Serafina in the middle, Emmett at the other end. The configuration was deliberate. Emmett wanted to watch them both. Garrison talked. He talked about business, about the weather, about a fishing trip he was planning. He told stories about Serafina as a child, charming, rehearsed anecdotes that painted a picture of a loving, if imperfect, single father doing his best. He laughed at his own stories. He touched Serafina's hand across the table when he referenced her, a gesture meant to look affectionate. Each time he touched her, her fork stopped moving. Each time he said her name, her shoulders rose a fraction of an inch. Each time he told a story about her childhood, something behind her eyes went dark, as though a light were being switched off, room by room, inside a house she could not escape. Emmett ate in silence. He spoke when spoken to. He gave nothing away. But his attention never wavered, and the architecture of his rage continued to build, floor by floor, corridor by corridor, until it was a structure so vast and so precise that it could have housed a city. After lunch, Garrison asked to speak with Serafina, alone. Just 5 minutes, he said. Father-daughter business. You understand? Emmett looked at Serafina. She was staring at the table. Her hands were in her lap. She had not looked up since the request was made. Of course, Emmett said. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to the door, and then he stopped. He did not turn around. He stood in the doorway, his back to the room, and he said the words with such quiet precision that they carried the weight of a verdict. Declan will be outside the door. If you need anything, Serafina, you only need to say so. The room went silent. Garrison's smile faltered. For one brief, unguarded moment, something crossed his face. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man who has just realized he's not in the room with someone he can manage. Emmett left. He walked to his study. He sat behind his desk. He waited. 7 minutes later, the door to the dining room opened. Footsteps. Garrison's voice in the foyer, loud and jovial, saying goodbye to no one in particular. The front door. A car engine. Gravel. Silence. Emmett walked to the dining room. Serafina was standing by the window. Her back was to the door. Her arms were wrapped around herself. She was shaking, not crying, not speaking, just shaking as though her body were trying to expel something it had been holding for most of her life. He stood in the doorway. Serafina. She did not turn. He won't visit again, Emmett said. She turned now. Her face was streaked with tears she had not made a sound producing. Her eyes were red, raw, furious in a way he had not seen before, not at him, not at anyone in the room, but at something vast and systemic and years deep, something that could not be fixed with a single sentence. You don't know what he... I know, Emmett said, 2 words, spoken without drama, without elaboration, without the need to prove or explain. I know. Serafina stared at him. Something in her face changed. The fury did not disappear, but it shared space with something else now. Surprise, confusion, and the very first tentative filament of relief. The kind of relief that comes not from being saved, but from being believed. You know, she repeated, flat, testing. I know what he did to you. I know how long it went on. And I am telling you with absolute certainty that he will not be permitted in this house again. She opened her mouth, closed it, her hands unclenched. The shaking slowed. Why? She asked. Her voice was barely audible. Why would you care? It was the most honest question anyone had asked Emmett Calloway in years. And for a moment, he did not have an answer. Not because he didn't care, but because the word care felt insufficient, imprecise, too small for the thing that had taken root in his chest since the night he had seen her scars. He looked at her for a long time. Because what was done to you was not your fault, he said, and it should have been stopped by someone with the power to stop it. That person was not there then. I am here now. Serafina pressed her hand against her mouth. A sound escaped, not a cry, not a word, but something between them, something that lived in the space where language fails and the body speaks instead. She sank into the nearest chair. Emmett did not approach her. He did not touch her. He stood in the doorway of his own dining room and gave her the only thing he had ever been truly terrible at giving anyone. Space. Time. The right to fall apart without consequence. In the weeks that followed, Emmett Calloway began to dismantle himself, not visibly, not dramatically, not in any way his men would notice or his enemies would exploit, but quietly, in the small spaces, Between commands, he began removing the mechanisms of dominance that had governed every relationship he had ever had. He stopped entering rooms where she was without making sound first. A knock, a footstep, the clearing of his throat. He learned that she flinched less when she knew he was coming. He learned that anticipation was different from fear and that the distance between the two was a sound in a hallway. He stopped telling her where to sit, when to eat, what to do. He replaced commands with suggestions. Then he replaced suggestions with silence. Then he let silence become its own kind of invitation. The kind that said, "This is your space too, and you may use it however you choose." He noticed that she began to move differently. Not overnight, not in leaps, in millimeters. The first time she poured her own coffee before he had poured his, she hesitated with the pot in her hand, glancing at him sideways, waiting for correction. He said nothing. She poured. The next morning, she poured again without looking. The first time she walked down the center of a hallway instead of along the wall, she caught herself halfway through and corrected, pressing back toward the baseboard as though pulled by a magnetic force. But the next day, she made it 4 more steps toward the center before the pull took her back. And the day after that, 5. He watched these small victories, the way a man might watch a plant he had been told was dead begin to produce a single green leaf, with stillness, with attention, with the understanding that growth at this scale required not intervention but witness. One evening, 3 weeks after Garrison's visit, Serafina appeared in the doorway of Emmett's study. He was reading a financial report. Something routine. He looked up and found her standing there in a way he had not seen before. Not pressed against the frame, not braced for dismissal, but standing. Simply standing, her weight evenly distributed, her hands at her sides. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He set the report down. "Yes." "Why haven't you—" She stopped. She looked at the floor, then at the window, then back at him. "Why haven't you touched me?" The question sat in the room between them. It was not an invitation. It was a genuine inquiry, delivered with the confused sincerity of someone who had been taught that physical contact was a currency owed, and who could not understand why the debt had not been collected. Emmett leaned back in his chair. He considered the question with the same gravity he gave to anything that mattered. "Because you have not asked me to," he said. She blinked. "You're my husband." That is not the same thing as permission. Something broke open in her face. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was a small, private rearrangement of features, the brow softening, the jaw unclenching, the eyes filling with something that was not tears, but might have been their precursor. The look of someone who has just been told a rule they have lived under their entire life does not actually exist. "I don't understand you," she whispered. "I know," he said, and then, quietly, "That's all right." She stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she nodded once and left. Emmett returned to his report, but the words swam, the columns blurred. He sat for a long time staring at nothing, and he felt the architecture of his life, the carefully constructed fortress of control and indifference, develop its first crack, not from attack, from tenderness, which, he was beginning to learn, was infinitely more destructive. A week later, Declan came to him with an update. Garrison Morrow had been making calls, reaching out to contacts within the organization, asking questions about his daughter, about the arrangement, about whether the marriage was being honored. His language was careful, coded, but the implication was clear. He considered Serafina a transaction, and he wanted to ensure his investment was performing. Emmett listened to the report. His face did not change. "Does he have anyone's ear?" Emmett asked. "No one who matters. He's reaching, but he's getting bolder." "How bold?" He asked Vincent DeLuca if the marriage could be— Declan paused. "Renegotiated, if terms hadn't been met." Emmett's jaw tightened. It was the only visible reaction, but Declan, who had seen that particular jaw clench precede events that reshaped entire organizations, understood its weight. "Shut it down," Emmett said. "Quietly, make sure every door he tries to open closes before his hand reaches the knob. And Declan, sir, if he contacts her directly, phone, text, letter, message through a third party, I want to know within the hour." Declan nodded and left. Emmett sat in the silence of his study and thought about the mathematics of power. He had spent 30 years wielding it as a tool of accumulation. Territory, influence, capital. He had never once considered that power could be wielded as shelter, that the same structures built to dominate could, with intention, be reconfigured to protect. It was a new equation, and he was still learning the variables. That night, for the first time, Serafina knocked on his study door at 8 p.m. and asked if he wanted tea. He did not want tea. He had never, in 50 years of living, expressed a preference for tea. But he said yes. She made it in the kitchen. He heard the kettle, the clink of cups, the soft sound of her feet on the tile. When she returned, she set the cup on his desk, close enough to reach, far enough to not require proximity, and sat in the leather chair across from him. She did not speak. She held her own cup in both hands, her legs tucked beneath her, and she read. The cookbook again. She had moved on to a chapter about a grandmother in Oaxaca who made mole for 40 people every Sunday, and the description of the chocolate melting into the chili paste made her lips move slightly, unconsciously, as though she were tasting the words. Emmett pretended to work. He watched her read. He noticed that her shoulders were down. Her breathing was even. Her feet were bare, tucked beneath her, which meant she had removed her shoes somewhere between the kitchen and this room, which meant she had done something she had never done in this house before. She had made herself comfortable. The significance of bare feet, of relaxed shoulders, of a woman reading in a room with a man she had once been terrified to look at. These were small things. To anyone else, they would have been nothing. To Emmett Calloway, they were a language, and he was only beginning to learn it. 2 months into the marriage, on an evening in late October when the estate was bathed in the copper light of a dying season, Emmett Calloway sat across from his wife in the study and did the most difficult thing he had ever done. He let go. Serafina. She looked up from her book. The cookbook had been replaced, finally, by one of the novels he'd left on her nightstand. A slow, intricate story about a woman who walked across Spain alone, and Serafina had been reading it with the quiet intensity of someone discovering that other lives existed beyond the perimeter of her own. Yes, her voice had changed. He had noticed it changing over weeks, gaining half a register, losing the whispered thinness that had defined it, becoming something that took up space in a room rather than shrinking away from it. She still spoke carefully, but she no longer spoke as though each word were a debt. Emmett set down the pen he had been holding. He folded his hands on the desk. He looked at her with the kind of deliberate attention he reserved for moments that could not be undone. "I want you to know something," he said, "and I want you to hear it without thinking. I expect a response." She closed her book. She gave him her full attention. It struck him, again, as it struck him more and more often these days, how beautiful she was when she was not afraid. How the removal of fear changed the geometry of her face, opened her features, allowed her eyes to hold light instead of reflecting it away. "This arrangement was made without your consent," he said. "You were given to me by a man who had no right to give you. You were traded, like property, and I participated in that transaction. I may not have known the full extent of what you were escaping, but I knew you did not choose this. And I accepted it anyway." She did not move. Her hands tightened around the book in her lap. "I cannot undo that," he continued. "I cannot go back and make a different decision, but I can make one now." He paused. The study was quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the iwi oaks that lined the estate drive, and the last leaves of autumn scraped against each other with a sound like whispered arguments. You can leave. 3 words spoken with the precision and finality of a man who understood that this sentence might cost him more than any deal he had ever made. You can leave this house, this marriage, this arrangement. I will provide you with enough money to live independently for as long as you need. I will ensure that you are protected, that your father cannot reach you, that no one associated with me or with him will ever be in a position to harm you. You will owe me nothing. There will be no debt, no obligation, no consequence. Serafina stared at him. Her lips parted. Her eyes searched his face with an intensity he had never seen from her before. Not fear, not confusion, but something ferocious and fragile. The look of someone standing at the edge of something vast and trying to determine if it was real or another deception dressed as freedom. Her voice caught. She tried again. You're letting me go. I am telling you that you were never mine to keep. The sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. It rippled outward, displacing everything, every assumption, every expectation, every conditioned belief about what men offered and what women owed. Serafina's hands released the book. It slid from her lap and landed on the rug with a soft, muffled sound. She pressed her palms against her face. Her shoulders began to shake. The sound that came from behind her hands was not a sob, not a cry, but something deeper, a sound that comes from the place where pain is stored for so long that its release is indistinguishable from breaking. Emmett did not move. He sat in his chair and watched her come apart, and he did not go to her, did not comfort her, did not try to fix or contain or manage what she was feeling, because he understood with a clarity that had taken him 50 years and this woman to learn that some things must be felt completely before they can be released. Minutes passed. The light shifted. The room grew warmer, or perhaps that was his imagination. When Serafina lifted her face from her hands, her eyes were red and wet and bright. Not with sadness, with something he could not immediately identify. No one, she said quietly, has ever told me I could leave. He nodded. Not my father, not the counselors who were supposed to check on me, not the teachers who saw the bruises, not the doctors who stitched the cuts. No one in my entire life has ever looked at me and said, "You can go." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She straightened in the chair. And then she did something that Emmett Calloway, for all his experience in reading people, had not predicted. She laughed. It was small, wet, broken at the edges, but it was real. The laugh of someone who has just seen the absurdity of their own captivity from the outside for the first time. The laugh of someone who has just realized that the door they have been standing in front of for 20 years was never locked. "I'm not leaving," she said. Emmett's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker, a fracture in the control. "Serafina, I am not leaving," she repeated, firmer now, the words gaining weight. "Not because I'm afraid, not because I have nowhere to go, not because I owe you anything." She paused, her chin lifted. Her eyes held his, directly, fully, without looking away for the first time since the night they had met. "I'm staying because this is the first place I've ever been, where I'm not waiting for someone to hurt me." The room was very quiet. "I'm staying," she said, "because you gave me the choice." And that, her voice broke. She pressed her lips together, steadied herself, and finished. "That is the first real thing anyone has ever given me." Emmett Calloway sat behind the desk he had sat behind for 20 years, in the house he had built, with the earnings of a life he had never questioned, and he felt something shift inside him that would never shift back. A wall he did not know he had, because it had been there so long it had become indistinguishable from the man himself, developed a crack so deep it reached the foundation. He did not speak. He did not need to. She picked up her book. She opened it. She continued reading. And the silence between them, which had once been heavy with all the things they did not know how to say, became something else entirely. It became the silence of two people who had chosen, freely, deliberately, against all expectation, to be in the same room. It was the most intimate thing either of them had ever experienced. Winter came. The estate wore it well. Snow settled on the stone walls and the slate roof, turning the compound into something that looked, from a distance, like a photograph from another century. The gardens disappeared under white. The oaks stood skeletal against gray skies, and inside, the house grew smaller in the way winter houses do, rooms drawing closer, hallways shortening, the distance between people compressing with the cold. Serafina began cooking, not because she was asked, not because she felt obligated. She started one Tuesday afternoon, standing in the kitchen with the Oaxacan cookbook, open to a recipe for chicken in a green mole sauce, her brow furrowed, her fingers covered in tomatillo pulp, her hair pinned up in a way that kept slipping. The kitchen staff stood at a respectful distance, unsure whether to help or retreat. She waved them off. She wanted to do this alone. The first attempt was a disaster. She burned the chilies. She oversalted the sauce. The chicken was dry. She served it anyway, setting it on the dining table with the rigid formality of someone presenting evidence in a trial. Emmett ate every bite. "The chilies are wrong," she said, watching him. "They're fine. They're burned. I've eaten in worse circumstances." The corner of her mouth twitched, not a smile, something that preceded a smile, something that was learning to become one. By the third week of cooking, she had mastered the mole. By the fourth, she had moved on to a Tuscan ribollita from the earlier chapters. By the fifth, she was improvising, adding things, subtracting things, making the recipes her own. And Emmett, who had spent decades eating meals prepared by professionals, found himself looking forward to dinner for the first time in his adult life. Not for the food, for the way she set the plate in front of him, with pride now, not apology, with ownership, with the look of a woman who had made something with her own hands and was not afraid to stand behind it. The touching began in January. Not by design, not by discussion. It too began the way all honest intimacy begins, by accident, in the spaces where intention has not yet arrived. The first time was her hand, brushing against his as she handed him a cup of tea. Not deliberate, not pulled away, just allowed. The contact lasted less than a second, but they both felt it. The sudden, electric reality of skin against skin, of a boundary that had been meticulously maintained for months, developing its first, authorized crossing. The second time was his hand on her shoulder as he passed behind her chair. Light. Brief. A gesture so small it could have been imagined. But she did not flinch. She did not stiffen. She tilted her head slightly toward the place where his hand had been, as though trying to preserve the warmth. The third time, she reached for his hand during a movie they were watching in the living room. She did it without looking at him, her eyes on the screen, her fingers finding his in the darkness between them and closing around them with a pressure that was gentle and deliberate and absolutely certain. He held her hand. He did not squeeze. He did not pull. He held it the way one holds something that has been returned after a long absence, with care, with stillness, with the understanding that it could be reclaimed at any moment and that this, too, would be acceptable. They sat like that for the rest of the film. Neither of them could have told you what the movie was about. In February, Garrison Morrow made his last attempt. A letter arrived at the estate, handwritten, addressed to Serafina. Intercepted, as all mail was, by Declan's team. Declan brought it to Emmett. Emmett read it. The letter was 3 pages. It began with "missing you" and ended with "come home." In between, it wove a narrative of paternal devotion, of sacrifices made, of love that was imperfect but genuine. It acknowledged, in careful, strategic language, that things had been hard, that mistakes were made. The passive voice was deliberate, surgical. Mistakes were made. Not "I beat you." Not "I left scars on your back that you will carry for the rest of your life." Mistakes were made. as though the violence had been a weather event, something that happened to both of them equally, something for which fault was atmospheric and shared. Emmett set the letter on his desk. He looked at it for a long time. Then he stood, took the letter to Serafina's room, and placed it on her nightstand. She found it that evening. She read it standing up. She read it twice. When she finished, she folded it carefully, walked to the fireplace in the living room, and placed it on the burning logs. She stood watching it curl and blacken, and her face was still, and her breathing was even, and her hands were steady. Emmett stood behind her. Not close. Not far. Present. "He says he loves me," she said. Her voice was conversational, observational, as though she were describing the weather. "Do you believe him?" She watched the last corner of the paper dissolve into ash. "I used to," she said. "I used to think that love was supposed to hurt, that the pain was proof it was real, that if someone hit you and then apologized, the apology was the love, and the hitting was just—" She paused. "The cost of being loved." She turned to face him. "I don't believe that anymore." Emmett looked at her. The firelight caught the planes of her face, and for a moment she looked like someone he had never seen before, not the frightened girl from the wedding night, not the anxious wife from those first weeks, but someone new, someone who was building herself from the inside out, using materials that had never been available to her before. "What changed?" he asked. She held his gaze. "You showed me what it looks like when someone is careful with you," she said. "And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing that carelessness is love." He said nothing. She stepped toward him. One step, small but deliberate. She raised her hand and placed it against his chest, over his heart, and held it there. He could feel the warmth of her palm through his shirt. He could feel his own pulse beneath it, beating faster than he wanted it to, betraying the carefully maintained illusion that he was immune to things like this. "Thank you," she said, "for being the first person who was careful with me." Emmett Calloway, who had commanded an empire, who had negotiated with senators and silenced rivals, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of impenetrability, placed his hand over hers, and held it there, and said nothing, because some things are too large for words, and the only honest response is presence. Spring arrived with a violence of green. The gardens erupted, the oaks leafed out. Birds returned, filling the mornings with sound that made the estate feel less like a fortress and more like a place where things could grow. In March, Emmett hosted a gathering, business, nominally, associates, partners, the constellation of men and women who orbited his power. It was the first event since the wedding, and the first time Serafina would be seen publicly as his wife in a room full of people who measured power the way astronomers measure stars, by proximity to the center. She spent an hour choosing what to wear, not because she was indecisive, because she was deciding something. When she descended the staircase that evening, the foyer was already full. Conversation hummed, glasses clinked, men in dark suits and women in careful jewelry populated the rooms like chess pieces. She wore a black dress, simple, elegant. The fabric fell from her shoulders in clean lines, gathered at the waist, ending just below the knee. The dress was backless, not partially, not suggestively, completely. The fabric began at the small of her back and left everything above it exposed. The neckline was high, the front modest, but the back was open, and every scar was visible. Every ridge, every line, every mark that had been laid on her body by hands that should have held her instead. The room noticed. Conversations paused. Eyes moved. The particular silence that follows the unexpected spread through the foyer like a temperature change. Serafina descended the stairs with her shoulders back and her chin level and her eyes forward. She did not look at the scars. She did not cover them. She did not apologize for them. She wore them the way she wore the dress, as a choice made freely, belonging to no one but herself. Emmett stood at the bottom of the staircase. He watched her come down, and the expression on his face, the expression that his men would later describe in hushed, disbelieving tones to those who had not been present, was something none of them had ever seen. It was pride, not possessive pride, not the pride of ownership or display, but the pride of witnessing, the pride of watching someone you care about do the bravest thing you have ever seen anyone do. She reached the bottom of the stairs. She stood before him. Oh, the scars on her back were fully visible to every person in the room, and she did not flinch, and she did not hide, and she did not look at anyone for permission. Emmett extended his hand. She took it, and together they walked into the room. Late that night, after the guests had gone and the house had settled into its post-event quiet, Serafina stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the master's suite. The door was open. She was still in the dress. She had turned her back to the mirror and was looking over her shoulder at her own reflection, studying the scars with an expression that was neither shame nor anger. It was acknowledgement. Emmett appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame and watched her watch herself. "You terrified half the room tonight," he said. There was something in his voice she had not heard before. Warmth, amusement, the ghost of a smile. "They weren't looking at me," she said. "They were looking at the scars. They were looking at someone who wasn't hiding." She turned from the mirror. She faced him, in the low light of the bathroom, with the remnants of the evening still in her hair and on her skin. She looked at him with an openness that was almost unbearable, the openness of someone who has spent their entire life behind a wall and has at last chosen to step out from behind it. "I'm not hiding anymore," she said. He nodded. "I know." She crossed the room to where he stood. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, close enough that the space between them was no longer a distance, but a threshold. "Emmett," she said, just his name. No qualifier. No question. Just the sound of it, spoken by someone who was choosing to say it. He reached out, slowly, with the deliberate, conscious care that had become the defining feature of every interaction he had with this woman. His hand rose to the side of her face. His fingertips touched her jaw. He waited, watched, felt for the flinch that had accompanied every touch for months. It did not come. She leaned into his hand. She closed her eyes. And in the dark, behind her eyelids, she let herself feel something she had never felt before. The sensation of being touched by someone who was asking, not taking, of being held by someone who would let go the moment she wanted him to. He kissed her, gently, at the corner of her mouth, a kiss so light it was barely there, more question than statement, more invitation than claim. She answered by turning her head, by finding his lips with hers, by kissing him back with a tenderness that contained everything. Every month of silence, every carefully poured coffee, every evening spent reading in his study, every small, courageous step toward the center of a hallway. She had once been afraid to walk. When they separated, she was smiling. It was the most unguarded smile he had ever seen on a human face. "Stay," she whispered, and he understood that she was not asking him to stay in the room. She was not asking him to stay in the marriage. She was asking him to stay exactly as he was. Careful, patient, present, imperfect, the first man who had ever treated her body and her boundaries as something sacred. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She took his hand and led him out of the bathroom, through the bedroom, to the place where two people who had entered this arrangement, as strangers and adversaries had, through silence and attention and the slow, painstaking work of trust, become something neither of them had a word for yet. Something better than love, because it was chosen. Something stronger than marriage, because it was real. Months later, on a morning in early June, Serafina sat on the garden bench, where she had first read about the grandmother in Oaxaca. The bench was warm. The roses along the stone wall were blooming, violent and red, and the air smelled like grass and heat and beginning. She was not reading. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, Her face tilted toward the sun, her eyes closed. She was breathing, not the controlled four-count breathing of someone managing terror, just breathing, easily, naturally, the way a person breathes when there is nothing to be afraid of. She placed one hand on her stomach. She let it rest there. She smiled. Inside the house, Emmett stood at the window of his study, watching her. He was holding a cup of tea she had made him. The cup was warm in his hands. The day was long and unscheduled and full of the particular luxury that comes from having nowhere to be and no one to perform for. He watched her sitting in the sun, her face open to the sky, her body at ease in a way it had never been when he first knew her. And he thought about all the things he had accumulated in 50 years of living: wealth, power, territory, fear. And he understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who has finally stopped running from the truth, that none of it had ever mattered. Not the empire, not the reputation, not the carefully curated invulnerability that had defined his life. What mattered was this: a woman sitting in the sun, the absence of fear, a cup of tea made by someone who had chosen to stay. He set the cup down. He walked outside. She heard him coming. She did not flinch. She opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that was soft and steady and full of something luminous and earned. The expression of a woman who had walked through every kind of darkness and had emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. He sat beside her on the bench. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there together, in the morning light, in the garden of an empire built on violence, and they were silent, and the silence was not empty. The silence was full, full of everything they had survived, full of everything they had chosen, full of the extraordinary, unreasonable miracle of two people who had been given every reason to harden and had chosen instead to soften. True power is not control. True dominance is protection without possession, and freedom is not given by death or escape. It is chosen when fear no longer controls you.